What up, everybody? This is Double G for the third Fabulous Four podcast alongside my co-host, Duan. How's it going, man?
You know, we're now entering this kind of the second phase of this series. The first two episodes we both dealt with Leonard and Duran. The first fight, the spectacular performance from Duran. The second one, just a fascinating and controversial fight, the no mask fight. Now it's time to bring in, the third man into the equation, and that is, of course, someone who I've always looked at as one of the great action fighters of all time. I think he's someone who never really had a dull fight, or not many dull fights anyway in his career, and that is, of course, Tommy Hearns. As we said before, he was the youngest of this group of four, but by the time this fight rolls around, in 1981, he was the defending fighter of the year. Leonard was the biggest star in the division. It seemed the natural matchup to make, and it was only a matter of time before they did make it. And eventually it did come to pass. That was September 16th, 1981 in Caesars, and that's the fight we're going to talk about today.
So a couple of things that I really loved, not really learning, but just kind of remembering. And I was really young at this point, so I wasn't really a boxing fan quite yet. That would happen a few years down the line. But there was always talk of Hearns, and in this time frame, we even discussed this in a previous Fabulous Four podcast. There was a possibility that this fight was going to happen in 1978, and Angelo Dundee basically shut it down. He was basically saying, why are you guys going to fight for 100,000 or 200,000 when down the line this could be one of the big, this could be a huge money fight, and he proved to be right, because at the end of the day, this is the largest money fight in history at this point. So. Hearns was always looked at this time as like, okay, we know Sugar Ray. Everybody knows Sugar Ray. Sugar Ray's the Olympian. He just beat Duran twice. But there's this guy that only the true boxing fans know, and his name, he's got two nicknames. He's the Motor City Cobra. He's also known as the Hitman. Like, that's how bad this guy is. And we kind of think that he's going to beat Leonard, and there's this whole groundswell of that Tommy Hearns is the true killer in the welterweight division, yet not everybody knows who he is.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, Tommy ran through so many of his opponents so quickly. It's crazy to think by the time he fought Leonard, he wasn't even 23 yet. He'd had, 32 fights at that point. I think he'd stopped all but two opponents. He had ran through everybody, and he had some tough fights along the way, tough opponents along the way. And I think people were starting to feel that he was the right matchup for Leonard, and he was the guy. If there was somebody out there that could possibly give Leonard problems, it was somebody like Tommy.
And Tommy, up to this point, he comes into this fight, like you said, he's a very young man. He's 3 years Leonard's junior, and he's 32-0, and only two fights in his career up to this point had even gone the distance. So you're talking about a guy who he's just putting guys out very quickly. And he kind of has his, his coming out fight in a sense with, he wins the welterweight title from Pino Cuevas, and that's like the one where people go, okay, like, this guy's for real. Like, he just takes out the champ in 2 rounds in a fight that wasn't very competitive, even though, Cuevas comes out and he's like, he's ready to stand toe to toe and just throw with this guy. And Hearns just puts him away so easily. So, that's 4 fights prior to the Leonard fight. And just, like I said, he's the guy that everybody is sort of like, only the true fans know. We see this in all of these. You see it in MMA, you see it in boxing, and you go, here's the up and coming guy that nobody really knows about yet. And for a long time, that was Hearns, and it's sort of this build up to this humongous fight where Leonard is the one carrying the publicity, and Hearns just has to be Tommy Hearns in order to get this thing going.
Yeah, and as you said, that fight with Cuevas was somebody at the time. You'll remember when we spoke about Leonard Duran. The original fight they wanted for Ray Leonard was the Cuevas fight, because Cuevas was the other champion. They wanted a unification bout, and politics got in the way, and they ended up going with the Duran route. So it was Tommy who got to Cuevas first. And Cuevas at that time had been a world champion for four years. He defended his title 11 straight times, and 10 of them were by knockout. So this was a guy who people thought was one of the real deal fighters in this division. And for Tommy to just destroy him the way he did in under 2 rounds, that was quite chilling at the time. I think at the time, and I think a lot of people at that point just went, "Okay, I want nothing to do with Thomas Hearns."
There's another person in the Hearns equation that whenever anyone talks about Hearns, this name is soon to follow, and that's Emmanuel Stewart, who. He was Hearns' trainer. He took him in as a young kid, and Stewart actually has a very interesting history in of his own. Basically, his heart was just in boxing, and he actually tried to get away from boxing and have a regular life, and he got married, and he had a job in Detroit, and his father basically said, "Hey, I have this 15-year-old son who's your half brother. Can you take him in?" And his brother, the first thing he does is, "Can you teach me how to box?" And that kind of gets Stewart back in the boxing game, and is sort of the igniter for Kronk and for Hearns and everything. And that whole story is so tremendous to me. You did a lot of reading on these guys. Kind of explain the relationship and how Stewart took Tommy in early and basically built him into the man that he became.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things we've been talking about throughout this series has been kind of not just the fighters but the legendary trainers as well. Well, Leonard, you had, of course, Angelo Dundee. Duran had that legendary team of Ray Arcel and Freddie Brown, and then now with Tommy Hearns, you can't even speak about Tommy Hearns without mentioning Emmanuel Stewart and of course the Kronk Gym in Detroit. And Tommy himself was born in Tennessee, but his mom moved the family to Detroit when he was about 5. He had a fascination of boxing right from an early age, and he started boxing at about 10 in one of the local gyms there. And I think what happened was the trainer he was working with at the time retired, and he moved on to Kronk at that point. And Manny Stewart was just starting up in the Kronk Gym, and Detroit at that point had been kind of a little bit dormant as far as its boxing scene had went. It obviously had a great history with, Joe Louis grew up in Detroit, Ray Robinson was born in Detroit. There's a great tradition of boxing in the area, but it was really, I guess, that connection of Tommy Hearns and Emmanuel Stewart and the Kronk Gym that revitalised it and brought it back into that 80s era. And I guess initially, apparently, Manny didn't take a huge interest in Tommy Hearns when he came in. Tommy was 11 years old. He was only 55 pounds, just sickly thin. And I think Manny didn't really see that much in him initially, but one of the veteran trainers there, Walter Smith, apparently convinced Manny that, this was a guy worth paying attention to, because Tommy had certain things about him that you just couldn't teach. He had a lot of courage, and he had he was a good listener, and he had a great drive and determination, and those type of attributes that you can't train into a fighter. He had all of them, and also with his physique the way it was, it obviously gave him very unique potential amongst kind of up and coming fighters. And I guess Manny had a group of strong amateurs at that time. He was the Kronk Gym was an amateur gym at that point, and when those amateurs kind of reached the point where they were going to make the jump into the pro game, Manny just decided, he would follow them and become a pro trainer. And to talk a little bit about Tommy as an amateur, he was more of he was known as a boxer, kind of a hidden move type guy when he fought as an amateur. He ran up a record of 155 and 8. The timing probably just didn't work out for him in terms of the Olympics, because I think he was just a bit too young. When the 76 Olympics came around, he wasn't one of the top-rated fighters at the time. He'd fought, I think, Aaron Pryor a few times and lost. He also, when he was just 17, he lost the decision to Howard Davis, who won gold in Montreal, and he also won the Fall Barker Trophy for the most outstanding boxer. So there was a lot of good talent around that Tommy was competing with. He didn't have a huge amount of experience, and he was learning quickly on the job. He did eventually win the Golden Gloves in 77, and he represented America 12 times internationally. He only lost one. And, then there kind of came a time when a few of the fighters, Tommy was certainly one of them. Mickey Goodwin was another one. Were ready to go pro with Manny, and Manny, as I said, took the jump with them. And this is one of the things you learn that would also affect Hagler, is that, like, from not having the same pedigree that Leonard has, the doors were just much fewer doors were open for them to debut Tommy, and it would be the same for Marvin Hagler when he came through, because Manny was shopping Hearns' debut around because he saw how much buzz there was about Leonard, and he thought there'd be network interest in it, and there really wasn't. Nobody was in any way interested. They were just kind of laughing him out of it. And Manny borrowed all kinds of money to put on that first bill, but that was what it took to get his foot in the door. They had Hearns fight regularly and often, and something that surprised people was he emerged as a pro. They'd been working on his power. They'd been working on getting him to get the power behind his shots, and he started knocking everybody out by Tommy's, I think, first 14 fights, the furthest distance he'd gone was 4 rounds. And you talked about it earlier in the show already. They tried sliding by as an opponent for Leonard after his 11th fight, and ultimately what ended up happened with Leonard went and fought Floyd Sr. at that point instead. But that wasn't cut and dry. Like, that was something that was very close to happening. That fight had been agreed upon in principle. They were ready to have a press conference for the signing of that fight, and had that gone ahead, it was going to take place in the Providence Civic Centre. The date would have been in September of 78, and the purses would have been $100,000 for Leonard and 12.5 for Hearns. And as you said, Angie said, when these guys fight, it's going to be for a lot more money than that. And, Ray's just not ready for that. And one of the things that was in Dundee's contract when he agreed to coach Leonard was that he had veto on any opponent. So he put pay to that pretty quickly. And Tommy had to look in other directions. But the demand was, at least on a local level, starting to grow, because by the time Tommy reached his 13th fight, he knocked out a guy called Pedro Rojas in the first round, and the buzz around the Kronk Gym was building up, and there was a kind of a local following there. There was 8,000 people attended that fight, and after Tommy had got the big knockout, the crowd started chanting, "We want Leonard." So they were already positioning their guy for a run at the Olympic Golden Boy. And I think the 15th fight then for Leonard was a really big one. He fought Clyde Gray, or for Tommy, of course, it's not Leonard. He fought a guy called Clyde Gray, who was just kind of known as a really tough customer. And it was the first time Tommy was ever extended into later rounds. He ended up finishing it in the 10th round, which was also the final round. But he got really tired in that fight. And, that was kind of, I think, where people first started to question that maybe there was stamina issues with Tommy, because he was just getting so used to knocking everybody out quickly. So then we kind of move into early 79, and Hearns' team are making offers for everybody that's out there. There's Palomino, there's Benitez, there's a whole range of fighters out there, and they're trying to make big money offers to get these guys in the ring, and all of them are passing on them. He ends up fighting a guy called Alfonso Heyman in his 18th fight. That's the first time he goes the distance, and it's also his first live TV bout. Tommy was said to be a little bit sick going into that fight. He injured his hand, and he wasn't as devastating as usual, but I think it was still a pretty good performance. Like, people who saw him were quite impressed, but it just wasn't quite with the impact of some of his earlier fights. He had 2 fights at the end of 79, which I just wanted to mention briefly. The first was against a Thai fighter called Senzak Mansourian. And the reason why I wanted to mention that is just because it's just an interesting history note. Is the Thai fighter was actually has the record for the winning a world title in the shortest number of fights. He won it in his 3rd fight. And he's probably a guy a lot of people have seen on kind of record lists. Obviously, in 2014, Lomachenko drew with his record when he won a title in the 3rd fight as well. But it's a name probably a lot of people have heard, and they probably didn't realize he'd fought Tommy Hearns. By the time he did match up with Tommy, he was a little bit long in the tooth, and Tommy kind of ran through him. He put up a brave effort, but Tommy pretty much pummeled him and finished him off in 3 rounds. And the last fight then he had that year in 79 was against a guy called Mike Colbert. Now, Colbert was a genuine middleweight. He'd previously fought Hagler. So that was just an interesting one because, maybe that was already the Hearns team testing the water at a higher weight. When they had the opportunity to give him a much bigger opponent to see how he dealt with it. He went 10 rounds with Colbert, and it was a decision, but he looked reasonable in it. And we spoke about this before, but that was actually on the same broadcast as the night that Hagler and Leonard both fought for a world title for the first time. Leonard beat Benitez, and Hagler got jobbed with a draw against Fido Antuofermo. And Leonard and Hagler had both fought in Vegas, and it was a split site show with in Louisiana in the Superdome for a light heavyweight title fight between Marvin Johnson and Victor Galandes. The reason they did that, there was just some politics involved. The light heavyweight fight was a WBA fight. The welterweight title fight was a WBC fight, and they didn't want them both on the same bill. They brought Hearns in to back up that as chief support, back up the Louisiana bill, and so that was the first time many people had seen him on a card, and it was obviously the same night that Leonard won his world title. So you've now at that point created a link between the two, and then once we got into 1980, his march towards that fight with Cuevas was already well underway. He fought four times in the first 5 months of 1980. They were all knockouts. He went 9 rounds in total, and then obviously came the Cuevas fight. We talked about it already. Cuevas was somebody who a lot of people had a lot of regard for at the time, and Hearns just absolutely ran through him. He was only 21 going into the fight. Cuevas, as I said, world champion for 4 years, and Tommy just took him to school within 6 minutes. He'd had him out there, and to me that was Tommy Hearns at his scary best. If you look at him in that fight, he is absolutely incredible. But another thing he was also becoming was a little bit rich, and we talked about this on another show before, because the person who promoted that fight was a guy called Harold Smith, who was using an alias, and he was famous for essentially defrauding Wells Fargo out of $21 million, and he was overpaying a lot of boxers at the time to build himself a boxing empire. He gave
under the what was it, Muhammad Ali Promotions or something?
Yeah, Muhammad Ali Professional Sports.
Yes.
And Hearns had, up at that point, his biggest purse had been 85 grand. He got $500,000 for that fight, and they paid Cuevas $1 million. So he was now becoming a bit of a star, and he had a bit of money in the bank to go with it. The story didn't end so well for Smith, who, he got found out. His real name was Ross Fields. He'd had a long history of fraud, and he ended up serving 10 years for 31 counts of embezzlement.
Wow.
So that was Tommy's first big breakthrough. That's when he started to really kind of gain center stage. Now, his first two defensive as his title were a little bit underwhelming. In the first fight against Luis Primera, he did a lot of showboating, and people weren't that impressed with him. He won in the 6th round, but it just wasn't really what people want to see from him. Then in his next fight, he was up against a guy called Randy Shields, and people just were expecting a lot more from Tommy. It took him 12 rounds to get rid of Shields, and eventually Shields' dad, who was his coach, waved the towel. Shields was just completely outgunned for the entire match, and the crowd started to root a little bit behind him behind Shields, because they knew the script. They knew Tommy was just the much better fighter, and that he was going to win the fight. And because Shields was hanging it tough, and he was like being the plucky underdog and playing that role, the crowd was going to get a little bit behind him. And that's when some doubters kind of came out of the woodwork about Tommy. People were saying maybe he doesn't hit as hard as we were led to believe, and maybe if he fought Leonard, he would be found out. So there was beginning to be questions, but we were also moving towards him and Ray Leonard, because the deal was beginning to be negotiated, and part of the terms for that were that they would each fight on a doubleheader in the Astrodome. Hearns was going to go up against Pablo Baez, and Leonard would fight Ayub Kalule, and basically this was all just a setup for a big Leonard Hearns show. They were worried that Tommy hadn't had quite enough spotlight yet, and the fight wasn't as big as it could possibly be. And with the purses they were paying, and it was in the millions as Angelo Dundee predicted, Hearns' purse for this fight was going to be 5 million. Leonard's was 8 million. That's a flat fee, and then they were each getting 25% of any of the gross that went over 21 million in revenue, and it ended up doing about 36 million. So they got a sizable chunk of that. So there was a lot of money invested in this fight. To get them to where they needed to be, they put them on that double bill in the Astrodome, and both guys, of course, won in style. And I think people were at that point ready for the fight.
And that Astrodome card that you're talking about, complete just build up for the big money card. And I think the thing that makes me smile about that is, you see today, like depending on when people listen to this, there was a fight that Oscar De La Hoya had before he faced off against Floyd Mayweather, and that fight was supposed to just make sure people knew what was coming and just whet the appetite a little bit, and it kind of showed that. Okay, maybe De La Hoya is not, or it may have been before the Mayweather or the Pacquiao fight. I can't actually remember which one it was, but it was a light hitter, and De La Hoya's face ends up all red, and he gets hit far more than anyone thought he was going to get hit. And in similar, in this point, they actually did a good job, because Hearns went through his guy quickly, and then Leonard stops a guy who was undefeated, and there's a little bit of pro wrestling involved here, because the Kalule is Ugandan, and so they're doing some goofy stuff with witch doctors and just things to create interest and hype and fun for a fight that everyone knew was gonna be the next big fight.
That also, just as a side note, that was also a light middleweight title fight, the Kalule fight. So Leonard had stepped up a little bit in weight and won another title to just kind of, I don't know, enhance it even that little bit more.
Yeah, and Leonard had only fought in one time before, since the Duran fight. He took a fight in March of that year against a guy by the name of Larry Bonds in the Carrier Dome in Syracuse. So he fights Duran in November of 1980 for the second fight, and then now 10 months later is the Hearns fight. You know, the thing about this that I found quite interesting in going back and researching is mostly the amount of pressure that the media was putting on Leonard to get the to step in the ring with Hearns, and mostly it was are you scared of Tommy Hearns? And I'm sure a lot of it was in jest because Leonard had such a good relationship with a lot of the media. And he handled a lot of these questions really well, which was, I'm not scared of any man. The only thing I'm scared of is not getting the amount of money that I receive for putting on the kind of performances that I put on and stuff of that nature. But it was just like, I can't imagine, in current boxing, that media would be that glib and that comfortable in discussing these types of things, with fighters in the way that they did with Ray. And, it's probably a lot just because of how good he was with them. The thing about this Hearns fight, you talked a little, you alluded to it a little bit, is Hearns is all of a sudden making a little bit of money. And so heading into this fight, is the most important fight of his career, and his training camp. There were whispers around the training camp that it wasn't the best camp, and Emmanuel Stewart would come out later after the fight and just say that things I was able to get Tommy to do before, he wasn't listening. There's too many people in his posse. I mean, that age-old story. Tommy wants to play softball, just stuff like that. And then Tommy comes in for the weight. He comes in 2 pounds light, and people are expecting Tommy to be the type of guy, because of his size and that he's so big, that he'll diet down to 147 and then just balloon back up because of his weight and size. And so there were some weird things going on when it came to the weight cut. I don't think Emmanuel Stewart wanted to take any sort of the blame for it. I think he put a lot of that blame on Tommy himself. And just the training camp in general. What do you think about all of those things that sort of came out after, leading up to what is essentially, the biggest fight in Tommy Hearns' career at the age of 22 years old?
Yeah, apparently early in the camp, Hearns was looking absolutely incredible. He broke one of his sparring partners, Marlon Sterling's jaw, and everybody was going like, okay, Hearns means business in this, but maybe he just meant business a little bit too much, because Manny had the feeling that he was maybe overtraining, and he said, as you mentioned, he just couldn't get through to him at all. He's like, Tommy was doing his own thing. He was really driven for this fight, and he just was training himself into the ground. He made a decision a few days before the fight, after they'd wrapped up sparring, that he wanted to go and spar, and he just went off and sparred 7 rounds within, in fight week. And that's something that you wouldn't usually see a fighter do. You take that type of risk that close to a fight. There was other things as well, you mentioned the weight. He came in really light. Manny apparently had asked him to step on the scales 2 or 3 days out, and he wouldn't do it. And, I think the feeling with Manny was that, he knew that this was blowing up in his face, and he just couldn't do anything to stop it. I think he had a lot of fear going into this fight. And, there were some other distractions as well in the camp, where there was a story of, one of the people in Hearns' entourage fired off a gun by accident in the hotel, and, all security came in and searched the whole team and disarmed everybody till after the fight. And I'm sure those were distractions that Tommy just probably didn't need at that time, leading into the biggest fight of his career. And maybe it was just not being on that stage, and that Leonard had come in as a pro and he'd been on the big stage right from day one, and Tommy really hadn't. He had to kind of work his way up. Maybe he was just that little bit more anxious than Leonard was going into the fight.
And a couple other tidbits before we get into the actual fight. Dave Jacobs leaves the Leonard camp and heads over to the Hearns camp, though everybody in anything that I've ever read just underplayed the whole thing. Like Emmanuel Stewart was basically like, he couldn't tell me anything I didn't already know about Ray. Like, I've been studying Ray. I know Ray. I know everything I need to know about Ray. And, Jacobs was, it's very, very hard feelings for the entire thing. And he made a comment saying something like, the only thing that he hoped for was that something would happen and that the fight would never happen. Like, that was kind of how he was feeling. The psychology aspect, such a big deal in the second Leonard Duran fight, from Leonard's perspective. And Leonard is kind of lobbing, these insults that today, that in current culture, we would probably see as, very mean. Just talking about how Tommy's not that smart. Just constantly making fun of the fact that, Tommy is just, he wasn't the type of guy with the media that Ray was. He wasn't charming. He wasn't very quick-witted when it came to that. Like, he was very shy. It's not something that he really liked doing. And when he did do it, he would mostly keep it to, well, you have a big mouth, but, I'm going to knock you out, and it's not going to go past X round. Like, that's how he would do it, whereas Leonard would be a little bit more personal. So, that we got that going on. And, we mentioned that the boxing insiders, they thought that, okay, like, I have a secret here. Like, Tommy Hearns is better than anybody else knows. And so while Leonard opens as a favorite, as we get to fight time, Hearns actually becomes the favorite, 7-5 favorite, the betting favorite when it comes to the beginning of this fight. Like, I found that to be just amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, it's like the bookies were very set on the fact that they thought it was going to be a knockout. They didn't think this fight was going the distance. But just a few other things to mention just before we go into it. Like, this was the first welterweight unification fight since 1975. Like, Hearns was the WBA champion, which he'd won off Cuevas. Leonard was the WBC champion, which he'd won back from Duran. So that was the first time those belts had been united in a very long time. As he said, there was some gamesmanship on both sides. There was a thing with Mike Jacobs turning up in the Hearns camp. Manny Stewart has always pretty much dismissed that as, not really playing any way into their strategy. And as you said, there was just some pretty mean-spirited stuff from Leonard, which I think a lot of people didn't like. Tommy would fire back with, as you said, something about like, he's not going to go past 3 rounds or something, or going to knock him out. And I think one of the things Ray said was like, oh, well, like, if I fight with my mind, and I win fights with my mind, and if Tommy had a mind, he would actually he would probably use it to try win fights too, but he doesn't. So that's why he's got to talk about knockouts and stuff like that. And it wasn't very, very nice stuff. And I'm sure Tommy did like it, but he also just said, if he's trying to psych me out, he's really not doing a very good job, because this stuff isn't really bothering me at all. Another thing is, like, this, like, Caesars knew they had a big fight in their hand. They built a custom-built one-night arena for this that would hold 24,000. The attendance on the night was 23,618. The top ticket price was $500. And in terms of promoters, there was kind of a consortium. It was Dan Doyle, Shelley Finkel, and in their first kind of high-profile fight, of course, the Duvas, the main event. This was their big breakout night. Doyle was there to raise capital, essentially, and to handle pay-per-view sales. Finkel was brought in to be a link to Hearns' team, and he also had links to the Duvas, who at the time were just kind of small hall promoters, and this was their big breakout show. They also brought in Arum late, like they did in the Leonard Duran fights, to like source international deals and handle pay-per-view distribution and stuff, but he didn't really have anything to do with the actual promoting of the fight itself.
And we always, at least I like to go back to what was Customato thinking at this time? I use Sports Illustrated's archive a lot to look up some of this stuff, and he was constantly being quoted. And so this is a little bit of a long quote. I'll try to read through it quickly, but this is Customato about Tommy Hearns. Not a big Tommy Hearns fan at this point. He says, "I don't believe he's as good a fighter as everybody thinks. He doesn't throw punches with combination rhythm, like ta-ta-ta, like an Ali or a Robinson or a LaMotta when he was LaMotta. Hearns goes ta-ta-ta, there's a break in the rhythm, and then there's a break in the rhythm. A man of experience like Leonard can avoid every one of them. Leonard throws combinations. You can probably avoid the first, but you'll get hit with the second or the third or the fourth. Some guys can hurt you with the first punch or the last one, but they aren't like Leonard, who can knock you out with any punch he throws in a combination." Then he goes on to say, "Like all guys who rely on power, Hearns has neglected other areas like defense. If Shields, who we talked about before, who he had fought two fights prior to Leonard, if Shields had any kind of power, he'd have knocked him out. And that last guy he fought down in Houston, Baez, who wasn't too much, hit Hearns with the right hand and drove him to the ropes. Hearns covered up a la Ali. Somewhere along the line, Leonard will get him in the position where one of those incompetents got him. I mean incompetent compared to Leonard, and hit him like a dozen right hands to the jaw. Or if he gets him on the ropes like Baez had him, he'll stop him. Leonard won't let him get away. Leonard is one hell of a finisher like Robinson was." So, I mean, I don't know if D'Amato had like a crystal ball or whatever, but he probably didn't give Hearns enough credit.
Yeah,
obviously,
you can't say 100% that he. And this one, it's not 100%. He was right in the first half. I think he undersells kind of what Tommy was able to do in terms of the boxing match in this part of the in this fight. But what he did in terms of calling the finish, he probably couldn't have got it that much more right.
Right. Obviously he didn't think that Hearns was as built, as much as people did, but he did feel like Leonard, was the better fighter, and it's just, I'm just constantly amazed going through these Cuss quotes to see how right on the money he is with a lot of this stuff, which he's one of the greatest minds. Okay, so let's get into the fight. The fight. The way that this fight starts is it's like a tale of like 3 or 4 different fights all into one, and just watching this fight and sort of reading, your play-by-play and my play-by-play, which is already published on the website, as sort of the thoughts that we had at watching this again. The first 5 rounds really is Tommy Hearns using every bit of his height, of his range, of his boxing skill, to show the show that Leonard is really has to work hard to get inside and to hit him, and then after that it's the fight just really changes. But going back and thinking about those first few rounds, is it surprising to you, or is that sort of how you would think that a fight like this would play out?
No, this is one of these fights that flips conventional wisdom on its head, and you see it so many times in boxing for whatever reason. Everybody has a set vision of how a fight's going to work out, and then it just ends up going, for whatever reason, completely the opposite. Like, this was being billed as the boxer versus the puncher, with Leonard as the boxer and Hearns the puncher. But Tommy won those early rounds using his boxing skills. Now, it got off the very tentative opening. Like, both guys were very cagey. I think that's part of why Tommy was able to dominate a bit, because when no one's taking big chances, I think your physical advantages are going to count more. And Tommy did have those physical advantages, to reach and things like that. So I think he was able to get off his shots, and Leonard just found like the size disadvantage he was at something to overcome, and it took him a little while to figure out. At the end of for the first round, nearly nothing happens, but then at the very end of the round, there's Tommy lands after the bell. Apparently what happened there is, our old friend Roger Mayweather, or Roger Leonard, once again jumped up on the apron and shouted something at Ray, and Ray turned around distracted, and Tommy just waffled him while he was looking at Roger, and I think the corner just pretty much shooed Roger off to the stand after that point and took him out of the equation. But I think it was maybe the third round. You look at Tommy's hand speed in that. For a big guy, it is absolutely incredible. He is out-quicking Leonard. He's as fast as I think any welterweight I've ever seen in that round. It really is something very impressive. And I actually gave him the sweep of those first 5 rounds. I don't know if you did.
Yes, I did. I mean, there were a couple close ones, but it just seemed that this was exactly what Hearns had wanted the fight to start out as. So I thought he was clearly in control.
Yeah, I would agree. Then I think there was a change in the 6th where Ray, I think, felt that the fight was slipping from him and he had to do something, and he started loading up on big shots and just trying to walk Tommy down and engage with him, and he started to get through with some big hits that took Tommy's legs. Tommy's legs were gone a couple of times in this round, and then there was one shot to the body in particular that I thought really took a lot out of Hearns, and I found it interesting because I noted in our write-up that I thought that was a shot that Tommy didn't fully recover from for the rest of the fight. And I remember I found out later that Manny Stewart actually said the exact same thing. He said, that one body shot in the 6th round was the one that did all the damage to Tommy. His gas tank never really recovered from after that.
Yeah, I mean, it was a brutal shot, just wicked. So, like you said, first 5, I think like you said, for round 1 was not really anything happening. But round 4, Leonard seemed to be doing a pretty decent job. And what is, we're so used to Leonard stealing rounds late. He actually gave away this round late. Just kind of being a little, not his normal style, and he got caught with a couple shots late, and essentially Tommy stole the round. But as you go into round 5, I sort of wondered watching this fight. I thought that, Leonard, you could tell Leonard is thinking. He's trying to figure things out. And Hearns' confidence is growing. And I kind of wonder if in this round, you even mentioned it, Hearns starts to mimic Ray's showboating, and you thought it was possibly a sign of Tommy kind of losing his grip on the mental game. And I sort of saw it as he's almost getting too confident in his ability to just be able to land from deep, and just Leonard just not having any success at figuring it out and getting inside or anything. And so, at round 5, Hearns clearly wins the round, but you start to wonder, you're like, okay, is he getting a little too confident? Because, you're only a third of the way through the fight, and Hearns is smiling, and he feels like, this fight is going exactly the way that he wanted. And then in the 6th round, that's the big one that we just talked about, where it's Ray's first clear win, and you start to wonder about Tommy's legs here, because Hearns had hit Leonard good in one of the first few rounds, and Leonard kind of, he's almost caught off balance, and he's going to the ropes and quickly struggling, but you never feel that his legs are gone, and in this round you kind of feel like, wow, Hearns hasn't really gotten hit all fight long, and then Leonard lands this uppercut, and it's almost like a baby giraffe on skates. Hearns his legs are kind of moving every which way, and I kind of wondered, wow, it was only really one shot that Leonard got, and maybe it was just the perfect one that got Hearns wobbly, and then the left hook to the body. And so this is where, it sort of becomes Leonard's fight. He goes along on both of our scorecards to win the next 2. And at the end of round 8, Stewart says something pretty interesting, I thought. And the guy who was on the broadcast, he said that he doesn't think Stewart was he meant anything by it. He was just trying to use it to psych Tommy up. But basically, Stewart says to Tommy, he says, I'm going to stop this fight if you don't start punching back. And, this is a fight where his fighter is clearly winning. Like, there's no doubt that Tommy's winning this fight. So I thought that comment was a little weird. What did you think about when you heard that?
Yeah, and I've heard, like, in Four Kings, Stewart years later reiterated that, he was thinking about stopping the fight and that. And it goes back to that thing that I was saying before, where he knew that there was just something off going into this fight. He knew that Tommy wasn't there at 100%, and I think when he saw his legs go the way he did, he was thinking, this is not ending well for my guy. And he was asking Tommy to show him something in those rounds, and Tommy obviously did enough to keep himself in the fight. But I think Manny knew that this was getting really tough for his guy, and maybe he wanted to pull him out. Maybe he at that point was thinking, I can't justify it right now because he's still fighting back. But I think there was probably a part of him that knew how tough Ray was and how well conditioned Ray was, and that Tommy had lost something going into that as we entered the second half of the fight.
And we had talked about it earlier, which was there's sort of like a couple of different themes to this fight, and all of a sudden the roles switch, and Leonard becomes the predator, and Hearns becomes the boxer. And so, the first few rounds, it's the other way around, and sort of like what we thought. But as Leonard starts to hit Hearns, a lot more cleanly, he becomes the guy who's the puncher, and Hearns, tries to become the boxer. Just a completely like 180 shift as we head into the second half of this fight. And it actually starts working for Hearns because he finally gets his legs underneath him again. And in rounds 9, rounds 10, rounds 11, we both score clearly for Hearns. Both of us have those scores. And in round 12, it's the first time that you and I actually have a little bit of a disagreement on the round. But round 12 is sort of the end of round 12 is kind of where the fight changes hands, and where Angelo Dundee fires Ray up to basically go out and win this fight. But I kind of was wondering, and I don't know what you think about this, but round 11, which we both said that Hearns won, I was starting to wonder if Ray was trying to get Hearns to get more confident in engaging more, because like I said, Hearns had all of a sudden turned into the boxer, and Ray couldn't really catch up to him and land anything cleanly. And so it was almost like Ray was standing a little bit more still, not moving his head as much. Hearns, was kind of getting a little bit more confident. He's throwing more right hands, and Ray, Ray lost the round. But I was sort of wondering if he kind of took that loss as a way to bring Tommy out a little bit more, knowing that he's down on the scorecards. More than likely he's going to have to stop Tommy to win this fight. And the way that he's going to be able to stop Tommy is if he gets Tommy to come forward more than he had been going. But did you get any sort of feeling like that at all?
Yeah, that's interesting, because I look at those rounds, the rounds 9, 10, 11, and I see them as if you want to make a case that Ray Leonard couldn't outbox Tommy Hearns, those are the rounds you look at, because Tommy was at this point running on close to empty, but he was still able to cause Leonard just all kinds of trouble, and Ray couldn't really do anything with him. But as you said, like that 11th round, he starts to kind of, I think it's like he's almost giving away the round. Mm-hmm. He really didn't do a lot, but he was trying to draw shots, and that was in that 11th round. It was the first time I thought in the whole fight that Tommy started to look like he was becoming the more physically imposing one. He looked like he was ready to start putting it on Leonard and trying to take him out again, which he had been completely boxing for the 2 or 3 rounds before that. He was just making himself a difficult target for Leonard, and Leonard managed to drag him back into get Tommy thinking that, okay, maybe I can take this guy out again, or maybe it's the time to put the pressure on. And that is when the beginning of the end started, because when Tommy had that confidence back in, and it gave Ray the opportunity to, to slug with him some more and trade big shots.
And so after the 12th round, the famous quote, "You're blowing it, son." Dundee's is saying this to Leonard as he's got the end swell over the eyes, and he's trying to get the swelling down on Leonard's face, and all of a sudden it's a trigger to Leonard, and he just comes out like a ball of fire, almost like, if you compare the energy in the two, it's almost like Hearns just is overwhelmed by Leonard's energy here. You mentioned in your write-up that Tommy's legs start to give way again, and he just all of a sudden looks like a tired fighter. And Leonard hits him with a big right. He follows up with a tremendous flurry, like the fastest hands you will ever see in your life. And Tommy can't do anything. Like he's like trying to grab, but Leonard's hands are moving so fast, and he just doesn't know what to do. So he just kind of falls back, and then he falls through the ropes. The referee doesn't even count this. I guess Leonard had kind of pushed him a little bit, so he didn't really count it as a knockdown. But you wrote that at that moment, it's like, okay, that no matter if that's a knockdown or not, like that's where Tommy just figured, like, okay, like this is like I just can't. I can't do this anymore. And so, he puts him down again into the ropes, and that one actually counts. So, depending on whether you count the first one as a knockout, it's either a 10-8 or 10-7. But just, where does Leonard get that energy? We're in round 13. They've been fighting such a, not the fastest pace or anything, but just, they're not doing anything, and they're taking punishment, and these guys are, hitting hard. Like, where does he come up with the energy in round 13 to just go after this guy?
It just seems that Angelo Dundee always knew the right thing to say to Leonard to push his buttons and, to get his mind back on the job. And that's what he did here. And, as I said, like, Tommy started to fall apart. And, that segment where Ray puts him back against the ropes for the first time and just hits him with the flurries against the ropes, and Tommy eventually falls through. That's what we were talking about with Customato, essentially called move for move on. That was pretty much a perfect call from Cus. But like that first knockdown that wasn't counted, I looked at the way Tommy got up in that, and you're just like, this fight is over. He was so sluggish getting back to his feet. And it's something that people always make reference to now when you see a young fighter who gets hurt for the first time and he doesn't know to tie up. They always reference this fight at that point. They always talk about how Tommy Hearns didn't know how to tie up in that 13th round against Leonard, and that really was it, because Tommy just needed to get his head clear and get his legs back under him. But he tried fight through it bravely. Ray eventually did get the count towards the end of the round. He put him down, and Tommy beat it and got back up. But the fight was over. I think, like, if the ref had stopped it on that knockdown, I don't think anyone would have felt very aggrieved, because I think we all saw where it was going in the next round.
Yeah, I mean, the writing was on the wall. Hearns didn't have anything left. Sugar Ray could tell. Like, he bolts out of the corner, and it's just like Tommy just looks at him like, come on, man. Like, really? And it was over. I mean, it's so over that Leonard hits Hearns, or Leonard hits him, and he just celebrates as Hearns is like trying to catch his feet. Like, he doesn't go down, but he just puts his hands in the air. It's almost like he knows, okay, I just have to throw a couple more combinations. This thing's stopped, and that's what happens. And Hearns he continually said that, I wasn't really hurt, and the fight shouldn't have been stopped. But I don't know how you can watch that thing and not believe that the fight was stopped perfectly. I would have stopped it the round before.
Yeah, I would have stopped it the round before too. One thing that was interesting actually is Dundee was furious going into that 14th round because they only called the one knockdown, and he felt that this fight could be close on the cards, and that second knockdown would give Ray the extra point. And he told Leonard going into that 14, he said, "You might be behind. Go out and finish this." And he said, like, he didn't really believe in his heart of hearts that Ray was behind. He said, like, he thought he turned it around in that 13th round, and he was probably, now winning the fight, or at least at evens or something like that. But it turned out he was right. He was, like, Ray was behind. He was largely behind, and he did need that knockout at the time he got it. So it's just another interesting tidbit that goes with this fight. If Ray had have eased off the gas there and just seen out and let Tommy off the hook and went to the last 2 rounds, we'd have a very different picture of history, I imagine.
It's too bad because, like you said, if this fight ends a little bit earlier or whatever, like how Tommy Hearns' career goes in one direction, and Sugar Ray probably, his career probably doesn't really change that much, but for Hearns it would have been such a big deal to win this fight, and then he would go on and lose another big fight, which we'll talk about in a few episodes with Hagler. That's maybe the most remembered fight in the weight class of the last 50 years or whatever, but this is a question that you posed to me earlier, and I'll throw it out there now. We can both answer, but I sort of just thinking about what Cuss said. At any point in their careers, would this have changed, or was Ray always just going to be that much better than Tommy was?
It's so hard to know, because at the time of the stoppage, did you have Hearns ahead? I had Hearns up.
Yes.
Okay, so my scorecard at the time of stoppage was 8-5 in favor of Tommy, but I also I scored 2 knockdowns in that 13th round. I gave it a 10-7, so I was only 1 point in the difference. The official judges' cards were 120, 125, 121, 125, 122, and 124, 122, all for Tommy. So, 2 years later, WBC fights would no longer be fought under 15 round rules. They'd be moved back to 12 round rules. And had this have been a 12 round fight, Tommy would have been the champion. This was the last time Ray ever fought into the 13th round, but he really needed it in this fight. If he hadn't had those 3 championship rounds, he wouldn't have won the fight, and it's just as simple as that. So that's something to think about. But also, I think, my feeling is that just when they were both at their peak, I think Ray had that extra gear, like he did in this fight. And I think maybe if it had been a 12-round fight, maybe would have found it earlier. You can make that argument. That I think he just had something extra in his tank to go to that maybe Tommy didn't have, and that was what was the difference maker. You can also look at Tommy's prep for this. Did he leave something on the scales? Could he, if he had came in at the full 147 pounds and had tapered off training a little bit more, would he have been stronger in the ring, and would that have made a difference? There's a lot of factors to kind of take into consideration when you look at this. And of course they did eventually rematch, but it wasn't until 1989. It was a long time later.
So just a couple of quick tidbits sort of about the gate and all that stuff. So we had Leonard got a guarantee of $8 million. Hearns was guaranteed $5 million, but they also received a percentage of the revenue. So Leonard actually ended up with 11, and Hearns got 8 total. They did. We talked about Arum, sort of always at least having a little pinky toe in the water of all of these fights. the pay-per-view stuff, like the pay-per-view was available in 1 million homes in 24 cities. So, 1981, there's a little bit of pay-per-view availability here. HBO secured the broadcast rights, and they aired the fight, I think it was, 10 days later or so. So you mentioned sellout crowd already, 23,618. The fight grossed over $35 million. Live gate was just under $6 million, and the revenue from pay-per-view was $7.5 million. So it becomes the biggest money fight of all time up to that point. Now, a couple of things, this is really a turning point in Sugar Ray's career, because if you look just look at his Wikipedia page and you can see where the Hearns fight is, and then you look at sort of his fight record, and the guy only has something like 8 fights left in his entire career, and we're only in 1981. So, Leonard is not going to be fighting all that much, and he'll fight Hagler, he'll fight Hearns, he'll fight Duran again for a third time. But really, outside of that Hagler fight, the bulk of his work in the Fab Four, when it comes to actually being at the top of his game, is done. And Hearns is actually a little bit different because he stays much busier. He's going to fight Duran. He's going to fight Hagler, and he's still going to be, we're moving into 1985, and he'll still be, pretty much at the top of his game until 1985. So we'll have more with Hearns coming up in the next few podcasts. But it's just, it always alarms me when I look at Sugar Ray's fight record to see how frequently he fights because of how many times he retires. He has the problem with the detached retina. He puts off the Hagler fight for about 5 years, and he actually gets one over on Hagler, which we'll go into heavy detail about when that fight comes. But, he essentially invites everyone to a press conference, and, Hagler's thinking that, this is when he's going to say that we're going to fight. And in actuality, Leonard just says, "Oh, no, sorry, guys, I'm retiring." Like, just the rest of Leonard's career after this fight is just weird.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting is insiders at the time, when this fight was even building up, they were already talking about the winner against Marvin Hagler, even though neither of the guys were middleweights. There was, Marvin had a great quote in the build-up when he said something to the effect of, one of these guys is going to be a loser and the other one's doomed because he's going to be fighting me. But then in the immediate aftermath of the fight, Ray was a lot more respectful to Tommy afterwards. He put him over as kind of a great athlete, and he apologized for calling him stupid and things like that. But when he was pressed on fighting Marvin, he said, he wasn't that eager to move up to middleweight yet. He said, he still had he would do it at some stage, but that wasn't now. And when they kept asking about it, he essentially said, well, the longer I leave it, the older he gets, which is a really strange thing to say. Because generally somebody be trying to, even if that was their strategy, they'd be trying to protect themselves from looking like they were ducking a fighter. But yeah, he also made jokes that, oh well, Tommy can have him instead. He can take on Hagler, and I'll leave those two to fight it out and things like that. So it was a little bit of a weird one. But just before we finish off talking about Leonard Hearns, I just wanted to go back to what George Kimball said on this, because a lot of what we've done in this podcast has been influenced by George Kimball's work, but we haven't really used a lot of his own words because George is the reporter that he was. He didn't put himself into it all that much, but I have a feeling this was a match that he was especially fond of, so I just thought it would be interesting to take his words on this one. And what he said about it was like that magical evening in the desert remains, in the estimation of most boxing historians, the greatest welterweight fight of all time. I've covered nearly 400 world title bouts since, but with all its fascinating nuance, Leonard Hearns remains the best fight I was ever privileged to watch.
And the words can't get any bigger than that. I think that's a great way to end on. The next episode we will introduce the great Marvin Hagler, and we will get to see an old friend who was in the first two episodes, Roberto Duran. So we'll revisit with Duran. We'll meet Marvin Hagler. We'll go over Hagler's career a bit, and we'll talk about their fight in episode 4. Is there anything else you want to close out with?
No, just as you said, the person who's been kind of the driving force behind a lot of these early podcasts has been, of course, Ray Leonard. This will be the point that we say bye to him for a little while now, and we bring in Marvin Hagler. And when we started this series, we said, the legend of the Fabulous Four has always been sort of as, the great era of middleweight boxing, the golden age of middleweight boxing. Well, the reason it is the golden age of middleweight boxing is because of one man, and that's Marvin Hagler. He was the only career middleweight of the whole group, and he was the guy that all the others moved up in weight to fight. So next time on the podcast, we'll be meeting him, and we'll be getting back to Roberto Duran. He did what he always did, and he came back from no mass. He rebuilt himself, and he was ready to go a second time. So we're back in Caesars again for this next fight. It's November of '83, and it's Hagler versus Duran, 15 rounds for the middleweight championship.
Yeah, so fast forward 2 years, and so we'll be back for episode 4. We will see you when we see you. Thanks to Duan. Peace out.